house of evil. Parker Keegan was a practical man, not much given to daydreaming or speculation. That was as it should be, for Parker made his living, if you can call it that, driving a truck with high explosives, tanks containing acetylene, oxygen, nitrogen, and other flammable substances for a welding company in upstate New York. So you see, he had to have his mind on his work all the time if he wants to get old. His wife Rebecca was a more emotional type. That too, there's some thunder. That too was as it should be. She was an artist, freelancing, and now and again making sales. There was some Native American blood in her, and she had had an occasional bout with the supernatural. But these were mainly small things. Telepathy, or dream experiences, and anything that really worried her. Neither she nor her husband had any notions that such things as haunted houses really existed, except of course in Victorian novels. Now the Keegans already had one child, and Rebecca was expecting her second, so they decided to look for a larger place. As if by the finger of fate, an opportunity came their way just about then. Her young cousin Jane telephoned Rebecca at her parents' home to tell them of the place they might possibly rent. It developed she didn't this not entirely out of the goodness of her heart, but because she didn't like being alone nights in the big place she and her husband lived in. He worked most of the night in another city. There are two halves to this house, Jane explained, and she made it so enticing that Parker and Rebecca decided then and there to drive over and never look at it. Even though they arrived there after dark, they saw immediately that the house was attractive, at least from the outside. Built in pre-Civil War days, it stood the test of time well. As is often the case with old houses, the servant quarters were in a separate unit and parallel, but do not intrude upon the main section of the house. So it was here, and it was the former servant quarters that Jane and Harry occupied. As the visitors had not spoken to the landlord about their interest, they entered the unused portion of the building from their cousin's apartment. This was once the main house and contained 8 rooms, just what they needed. 8 rooms is just what they needed. The ground floor consisted of a large front room with 2 windows facing the road and 2 facing the other way. Next to it was an old-fashioned dining room, and branching off from it, a narrow kitchen and a small laundry room. In the dim... In the dim light, they could make out a marvelous staircase with a lovely oiled banister. It was at this point that the 2 apartments that made up the house connected, and one could be entered into from the other. Underneath the front stairway was a closet and a door leading to the other side of the house, but they found another enclosed stairway leading from the bedroom at the top of the front stairs into the dining room. Exactly below this enclosed staircase were the cellar stairs leading into the basement. There were the 3 cellars, one under the servants' quarters, one underneath the front room, and one below the dining room. As Rebecca stepped into the cellar under the dining room, which had apparently served as a fruit cellar, she grew panicky for a moment. She immediately dismissed her anxiety with a proper explanation. She had seen the thriller Psycho the night before, and the cellar reminded her of one of the gruesome incidents in that movie. But later she was to learn that the feeling of panic persisted whenever she came down into this particular part of the basement, even long after she had forgotten the plot of the movie. For the present, they inspected the rest of the house. The upstairs portion contained 2 large bedrooms and 2 smaller ones. Only the larger rooms were heated. There was an attic, but nobody ever investigated it during their entire stay in the house. They decided the house was just what they wanted, and the next morning they contacted the owner. George Jones turned out to be a very proper, somewhat tight-lipped man. He inquired what they did for a living, and asked, "Are you religious people?" Rebecca thought this was an odd question, but since she had told him she was an artist, she assumed he considered artists somewhat unreliable and wanted to make sure he had responsible and God-fearing tenants. Only much later did it occur to her that Jones might have had other reasons. It was a cold, miserable day in December of 1964, when the Keegans moved into their new home. They were happy to get into a home full of atmosphere, for Rebecca was an avid amateur archaeologist who read everything on antiques she could get her hands on. At the same time, they were doing a good deed for her cousin, keeping her company on those long nights when her husband was away at work. It all seemed just right, and Rebecca did not even mind the difficulties the moving brought them. For one thing, they could afford professional moving men, but had turned to their friends for help. The friends in turn had borrowed a truck that had to be back in the garage by nightfall. So there was a lot of shoving and pushing and bad tempers all around. On top of that, the stinging cold and snow made things even more uncomfortable, and Rebecca could do little to help matters, being pregnant with their second child at the time. Late that first night, they finally climbed the stairs to the large bedroom. They were both exhausted from the day's work, and as soon as they fell into bed, they drifted off into deep sleep. But even though they were very tired, Rebecca could not help noticing some strange noises, crackling sounds emanating seemingly from her cousin's side of the house. She put them down to steam pipes and turned to the wall. When the noises returned night after night, Rebecca began to wonder about them. Parker also worked nights now, and she and Jane sat up together until the late show on television was over. Around 1:30 a.m. all that time, night after night, they would hear the steam pipes banging away. Nobody slept well in the house, and Jane became jumpier and jumpier as time went on. Her mood would change to a certain sullenness Rebecca had not noticed before, but she had dismissed it as being due to the winter weather and of no particular significance. Then one night, she was lying awake in bed thinking about some of the events of the recent past. Rebecca heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. They were the steps of a heavy man, and she had not heard the characteristic clicking of the front door lock. She knew it could not be her husband. Alarmed and thinking of burglars, she got out of bed and called out to her cousin. She then went to the top of the stairs and was joined by Jane coming through the connecting door and standing at the foot of the stairs. Sorry about that. What the two women saw from the opposite ends of the staircase was far from ordinary. They could hear someone walking up the stairs, and the stairs bending with each step as if every person was actually stepping upon them. Only there was no one to be seen. They did not wait until the footsteps of the invisible man reached the top of the stairs. Rebecca dove back into her bedroom, banging the door shut after her. Just before she did, she could still hear her young cousin downstairs screaming before she too ran back into the assumed safety of her bedroom. The experience on the stairs made Jane even moodier than before. It was not long afterwards that she took her little girl and left her husband. There had been no quarrel, no apparent reason for her sudden action. He was a handsome young man who treated her well, and Jane loved him, yet there it was. She could not stand the house any longer and did what her panicking mind told her to do. Rebecca was now left alone with the noisy wraith on the stairs, and she scarcely welcomed it. Soon after the incident, Jane's abandoned husband sold his belongings and moved away, leaving the former servants' quarters empty once again. It was then that Rebecca kept hearing, in addition to the heavy footsteps, what seemed to be someone crying in the empty side of the house. She convinced herself that it was just a case of nerves when the noises continued at frequent intervals. While she was fully awake, her time was almost at hand, and as sometimes happened with approaching motherhood, she grew more and more apprehensive. It did not help her condition any when she heard a loud banging of the cupboards in the dining room at the time when she was all alone in the house. Someone was opening and closing the doors to the cupboard and rapid succession soon after she had retired for the night. Of course, she did not run downstairs to investigate. Who would? Fortunately, Parker came home a little earlier that night because when he arrived, he found Rebecca in a state of near hysteria. To calm her fears as much to find out for himself, he immediately went downstairs to investigate. There was no one there, no noise. Getting into bed with the assurance of a man who did not believe in the supernatural, he's about to tell his wife that she must have dreamed it all, when he too clearly heard the cupboard doors open and close downstairs. He jumped out of bed and raced down the stairs. As he took the steps two at a time, he could clearly hear the doors banging louder and louder in the dining room. It must be stated to Parker's eternal credit that not once did he show fear or worry about any possible dangers to himself. He merely wanted to know what this was all about. The noise reached a crescendo of fury, it seemed to him, when he stood before the dining room door. Quickly he opened the door and stepped into the dark expanse of the chilly dining room. Instantly the noise stopped, as if it was cut with a knife. Shaking his head and beginning to doubt his own sanity, he released power of observation. Parker got into bed once more and prepared to go to sleep. Rebecca looked at him anxiously, but he did not say anything. Before she could question him, the ominous noise started up again downstairs. Once more, as if driven by the furies, Parker jumped out of the bed and raced downstairs. Again the noise stopped the moment he opened the dining room door. He slowly went up the stairs again and crawled into bed. Pulling the covers over his ears, he cursed the ghosts downstairs, but decided that his badly needed sleep was more important than the answer to this puzzle. Shortly after his son was born, when they returned from the hospital, they were greeted by a new couple, the Winters, who had just moved into the other half of the house. Although friendly on the surface, they were actually stern and unbending. And as they were much older than the Keegans, the two families did not mingle much. Miss Winters was a tough and somewhat sassy old woman who did not look as if anything could frighten her. Her husband worked as a night watchman, and there were no children. It was not long before Miss Winters knocked at Rebecca's door in fear. "Someone's trying to break in," she whispered, and asked to be let in. Rebecca knew better, but did not say anything to frighten the old woman even further. It seemed as if winter would never yield to spring, and if you have ever lived in the cold valleys of upstate New York, you know how depressing life can be under such circumstances. To brighten things a little, the Keegans acquired a female German Shepherd dog, and also for use as a watchdog. All this time, Rebecca made sure she was never alone in the house. There was someone watching her night and day. Her husband no longer scoffed at her fears, but could do little about them. The strange noises in the walls continued on and off, and got so that Rebecca no longer felt fear even when she saw the doorknob of a perfectly empty room turn slowly by its own volition. By now she knew the house was haunted, but as yet she did not realize the nature of the uncanny inhabitants. One day she left the baby securely strapped in his seat while she ran to catch her little girl who was climbing the front stairs and was in immediate danger of falling off. Just at the precise moment the strap broke and the baby fell to the floor, fracturing his skull. It seemed that all during their stay at the house, someone was always having accidents or becoming uncountably ill. Their debts increased as their medical expenses grew higher, so it was decided that Rebecca should go to work and earn some money. In addition, Parker started working extra shifts, but far from helping things, this only served to incite the landlord to raise their rent on the theory that they were earning more and could pay more. To make things even more difficult for them, Rebecca could find a proper babysitter to stay with the children while she was at work. Nobody would stay very long in the house once they got to know it. She turned to her mother for help, and her mother, after a short stay, refused to spend any more time in the house, but offered to take the children to her own home. There was no explanation, but to Rebecca it seemed ominous and obvious. Finally, her teenage sister Mary consented to become a babysitter for them. She could use the money for school, but soon her enthusiasm waned. She began to complain of a closed-in feeling she experienced in the old house, and of course she too heard all the strange noises. Each day Mary became more and more depressed and even ill, whereas she had been a happy-go-lucky girl before. her prowlers about. She kept saying it, and one day she came running to Rebecca in abject fear. On a moonless night, she happened to be glancing out of a living room window when she saw what appeared to be a face. Rebecca managed to calm her by suggesting she had seen some sort of shadow, but the incessant barking of the dog for no apparent reason made matters worse. Added to this were incidents in which objects would simply fly out of their hands. In broad daylight, the end of the rope was reached one day when they were all in the front room. It was afternoon. Mary's holding a cup in her hand, about to fill it with tea. That instant it flew out of her hands and smashed itself at Parker's feet. Without saying another word, the young girl went up the stairs to her room shortly after all her things were packed. She came down to say goodbye. Once again, they were without help, and when Rebecca's sister-in-law, Susan, saved the day for them. A simple and quite unimaginative person, she had put no stock into all the tales of going on she had heard, and was quite willing to prove her point. Within a day after her arrival, she changed her tune. "Someone is watching me," she complained, and she refused to stay alone now. She too complained of things flying off the shelf, seemingly by their own volition, and of cupboard doors opening and closing as someone were looking into the drawers for something or other. The footsteps going up the stairs continued, and Susan heard them many times. It's another screw-up. As a period after end, she took the dog to the house with her, but that was little use. The dog was more afraid than all the people together. Incredible, though it seemed that the Keegans, 2 years had passed since they had come to the house of evil. That they still had their sanity was amazing, and that they had not moved out even more amazing, but they simply could not afford to. And things were difficult enough in the physical world to allow unseen forces to add to their problems, so they stuck it out. It was the night before Christmas in 1966, and all through the house, a feeling of ominous evil poisoned the atmosphere. They were watching television. In order to relax a little, Rebecca suddenly saw a presence out of the corner of her eye. A person of some kind was standing near the window at the back of the sofa where her sister-in-law was sitting. Without raising her voice, unduly or taking her eyes off the spot, she said, "Susan, get the rifle." They had a rifle standing ready in the corner of the room. Only then did Susan take a sharp look at the face peering in the window. It was a man's face, and so unspeakably evil it took her breath away. Scowling at them with hatred, the face remained there for a moment while Susan grabbed the gun. But when she pointed towards the window, the face had disappeared. Immediately they rushed outside. The ground was frozen hard, so footprints would not have shown, had there been any. But they could not see anyone nor hear anyone running away. The dog, chained at a spot where an intruder would be visible to her, evidently did not feel anything. She did not bark. Was she in some strange way hypnotized? Shortly after Christmas, Susan had to leave, and the Keegans no longer could afford a babysitter. Rebecca quit her job, and the things were rough financially again. To help matters, they invited a young couple with a small child to move in with them and help share expenses. The husband did not believe in the supernatural, and his wife, on being told of their problem, showed herself open-minded, even interested. Although skeptical, what had appeared to be a sensible arrangement soon turned out to be a disaster, an additional burden to an already overburdened family. The farmers weren't going to contribute to the household, but spend what money they earned on liquor and arid racing. Tension between the Keegans and the farmers mounted steadily, but the monetary problems were not the sole cause. The farmers too noticed the noises and the unbearable heavy atmosphere of the house and instinctively blamed the Keegans for these things. Then there was a quilt with an early American eagle and ship motif printed on it. Soon the wife had noticed that someone had turned the quilt around after she put it away safely for the night. In the morning, the motive would face the opposite way. They could not blame the Keegans for that, since the quilt had been stored out of anyone's reach, and they dimly realized that the house was haunted. As the tensions grew, the two couples would scarcely speak to each other, even though they naturally shared the same quarters. Rebecca began to realize that no matter how cheery a person might have been on the outside, once such a person moved into the house of evil, there would be changes of personality and character. Although far from superstitious, he began to believe that the house itself was dangerous, and that prolonged life in it could only destroy her and her loved ones. One night in early April, Rebecca and Parker were in the bedroom upstairs when they saw a form cross from where their telephone was over the bed and then down the stairs. As if it crossed past the telephone, the phone rang. Instant later, as the form reached the bottom of the stairs, the downstairs telephone rang. This brought the farmers out screaming and demanding to know what was going on. For once, there was unison in the house as the four adults gathered together soberly downstairs to discuss what they just witnessed and compare impressions. They agreed there was a blue-white light around the form, a light so intense it hurt their eyes. They all felt the icy chill as the form passed them. Only Parker bravely insisted it might have been lightning, but no one had heard any thunder. For the farmers, this was the ghost that broke their patience back. They moved out the next day. Left alone once again to themselves, Rebecca and her husband decided it was time for them to look elsewhere too. Tired from the long struggle with the uncanny, they moved out soon afterwards. As soon as they settled in a new house, life took on a different aspect. Where ominous presences had dampened the spirits, there was now good spirits and a zest for life they had not known for years. Nobody in the family was feeling sick after the move, and they no longer had problems getting any babysitters. The House of Evil still stands on lonely Route 14, and there have been people living in it since, but whenever Parker had occasion to pass Route 14 in his car, he stepped on the gas and drove a bit faster. No sense taking chances. Alright, so that's story 2 in the book. Sorry, I was kind of stumbling there a little bit, but thanks everybody for checking this out.